You already know the four elemental spirits: Undines of water, Sylphs of air, Salamanders of fire, Gnomes of earth. The system Paracelsus built in the 16th century is clean, organized, and satisfying in the way that any good taxonomy is. But it is not the whole picture. Long before Paracelsus categorized the elements, the world was already full of spirits that belonged to rivers, mountains, flames, and deep soil. Some of them are older than written language. Some of them are still honored today. These are the elemental spirits that mythology built before anyone gave them a system. And some of them are stranger and older and considerably more dangerous than the versions you already know. Water spirits. Undines live where water is still. Rivers, pools, waterfalls. Not the violent crash of the ocean, but the quiet, deep places where water holds its surface and hides everything beneath it. They are usually shown as beautiful, almost human-looking, and almost entirely female. The almost is the important part. In Paracelsus's tradition, Undines are the elemental spirits of water itself. Later folklore turned them into beings who long specifically for human love, and in some versions, who can gain a soul through marriage. That detail transforms them from nature spirits into something considerably more poignant. They are not simply dangerous. They want something that the water cannot give them. That is why Undines work so well in mythology. They are not water as violent or water as flood. They are water as temptation, the soft surface hiding something ancient and cold underneath. When you hear the name Undine, think of the stillness of a pool that looks shallow and isn't. If Undines feel like a European fairy tale, Naiads feel like the living personality of a specific spring. Naiads are the freshwater nymphs of Greek mythology, tied not to water in general, but to particular rivers, lakes, streams, and fountains. They are usually described as beautiful, long-lived, and deeply connected to the local landscape around their water. Travelers left offerings at their springs. Farmers prayed to them for rain. They were not abstract forces. They were neighbors. One distinction worth knowing: Naiads are freshwater. Nereids are sea nymphs, the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, with Thetis, the mother of Achilles, being the most famous among them. Oceanids are a broader category connected to the great ocean that the ancient Greeks believed encircled the entire world. If the spirit belongs to a spring or stream, that is a naiad. If it belongs to the sea, a nereid. The Greeks were precise about this because water was precise about it. It appears on the riverbank as a horse, a beautiful horse, calm, still, almost inviting. That is a trap. The Kelpie of Scottish folklore is a shape-shifting spirit tied to rivers, streams, lochs, and deep pools. On land, it can look completely docile. Some stories say it can appear as a handsome young person instead, which makes the danger feel considerably more personal. But in every version, the mechanism is the same. It lures you close. It tricks you into touching it or climbing onto its back. And then it carries you into the water. The Kelpie's power is not strength. It is deception. It uses beauty, trust, and your own curiosity as weapons. Once it has you in the water wins. That is why the Kelpie works so well in folklore. It does not attack. It waits for you to approach it. It turns the calm surface of a loch into something that is actively watching you walk toward it. The Nixie of Germanic mythology does not have one face. It appears as a fair young woman, an old crone, a half-human, half-fish figure, or sometimes nothing visible at all, just music rising from the water. That shifting quality is part of what makes Nixie so difficult to prepare for. You cannot recognize what does not stay still long enough to be recognized. Nixies are famous for music, dance, and prophecy. They are also, in many traditions, genuinely malevolent, luring people into deep water, abducting children, pulling victims under before anyone on the bank realizes what happened. At the same time, some traditions say Nixies can marry humans and bear human children, which means they exist in that uncomfortable space between creature and person. Beautiful but dangerous, alluring but lethal. Human enough to want something from you, but never human enough to be trusted. If the Kelpie is the horse of the river, the Nixie is the singing face beneath its surface. Fire spirit. The real salamander is a small amphibian. It lives near water and has no relationship to fire whatsoever. That did not stop ancient writers from deciding it was a fire creature. Ancient observers noted that salamanders often emerged from logs when those logs were thrown onto a fire. The animals had been sheltering inside the wood and fled when it began to burn. What they saw was a creature appearing from flames. What they concluded was a creature that lived inside them. Paracelsus took that observation and built the salamander into the classic elemental of fire. Long, lean, spirit-like beings tied to flames, heat, and volcanic power. Not dragons. Something more subtle than that. Creatures that belong to fire the way a fish belongs to water. Present in it, shaped by it, unable to exist without it. The salamander is fire not as destruction, but as transformation. The element as a habitat, the idea that something could live inside, the thing that destroys everything else. It is not a creature with claws or teeth. It is a small light hovering over wet ground at night. Marshes, bogs, lonely paths where the ground is not quite solid and the safe way home is harder to see than it should be. It flickers, it moves, it appears to be going somewhere. And in folklore, the worst thing you can do is follow it. People believed the will-o'-the-wisp was a wandering soul or a trickster spirit or simply a supernatural flame that existed for the specific purpose of leading travelers off the path into the dark. It looks harmless. That is the point. It looks like a lantern someone is carrying ahead of you. It looks like help. The real explanation involves bioluminescent gases produced by decaying organic matter in wetland environments, methane and phosphine reacting at the surface to produce faint, shifting light. The folklore explanation is more honest about the danger. Not all fire spirits roar, some just glow quietly in the dark and wait for you to follow. In Brazilian folklore, the Boitatá is a giant fire serpent with blazing eyes. Its name comes from Tupi roots, meaning fire snake, and its origins lie in indigenous traditions that predate European contact. It guards fields, forests, and riverbanks. And its specific target is people who set the land on fire. What makes the Boitatá different from most fire spirits is its purpose. It is not fire as spectacle or fire as punishment for personal wrongdoing. It is fire as ecological guardian. The Boitatá watches the landscape, it remembers what was burned, and it strikes back at those who destroy what it protects. Some regional versions connect it to will-o'-the-wisp lights seen moving through the forest at night. Others describe it as a true serpent of flame crossing the open land. It is one of the clearest examples in world mythology of fire becoming a protector rather than a threat. The element turned inward to defend the world that contains it. German and Swiss folklore preserves a regional figure that most mythology surveys skip entirely. The fiery men are not a single worldwide myth with one fixed form. They are a class of local apparition, burning humanoid figures that appear in fields, roads, and bogs at night. Some accounts describe them as glowing. Others say they carry fire. Many connect them specifically to people who committed moral wrongs in life, particularly those who moved boundary stones to steal land from neighbors, and who now wander as punishment. That last detail is what distinguishes them from salamanders or will-o'-the-wisps. They are not natural fire spirits. They are human-shaped, walking punishment, haunted flame in the form of a person. They turn fire into a moral warning rather than a natural phenomenon, showing that in folklore, the same element can be both a force of nature and a form of judgment, depending on what it is wearing. Jinn are not a fire spirit in the way a salamander is a fire spirit. They are something significantly larger than that. In Islamic tradition, Jinn are beings created by God from smokeless fire, recognized as real spiritual entities with their own religion, culture, moral complexity, and relationship to the divine. They are not simply flames, they are invisible, intelligent, and powerful beings who can be good, evil, or anywhere in between. Some are devout, some are malicious, some live alongside humans without either party knowing it. The Quran describes them explicitly, which places them in a different category from the folk spirits of European tradition. They are not creatures of legend. They are creatures of theology. If the salamander is the elemental fire spirit of European occultism, Jinn are the great fire-born intelligence of Islamic cosmology. The same element approached by a completely different civilization, producing something far more complex than a creature that lives in flames. Earth spirits. Gnomes live below the surface, not near it, not beside it, inside it, moving through solid earth the way a fish moves through water, according to the tradition Paracelsus formalized in the 16th century. Small, ancient-looking, hunched, and connected to the deep soil, caves, and mineral veins that run through the ground beneath your feet. The important thing about gnomes is not their size. It is what they guard. Every vein of gold, every buried gem, every piece of wealth hidden in the earth. Gnomes are its custodians. They are the memory of what the ground contains and the intelligence that decides who is allowed to find it. When a story uses a gnome, it is usually saying something specific. The earth is not empty. It is alive. It is watching. And the things buried inside it are not simply waiting to be taken. They are being held. In Philippine folklore, the ground itself has a resident. The Nuno sa Punso, the old man of the mound, lives in ant hills and termite mounds, which are treated with respect in Tagalog tradition, specifically because of his presence. People passing near a mound say, "Tabi-tabi po," a phrase that translates roughly as "excuse me" or "please move aside," or not as superstition, but as practical social courtesy extended to an entity that has the power to make your life difficult if you ignore it. The Nuno is described as a small old man, sometimes with a long beard, and folk accounts say he can respond to disrespect with illness, swelling, or pain. He does not attack. He responds to what you give him. That is what makes the Nuno so effective as a cultural figure. He does not transform the earth into something dangerous. He turns it into a place with rules. You do not walk anywhere. You ask permission. The ground is inhabited, and the inhabitant has expectations. In Indian mythology, Yakshas are nature spirits tied to the earth, to roots, trees, buried treasure, and the raw, generative power of the land. They are usually benevolent. They can also be mischievous, dangerous, or violent toward travelers who enter wild places without proper caution. That split, generous when respected, threatening when crossed, gives Yakshas the same quality as the land itself, fertile and productive when treated well, indifferent and hostile when not. Kubera, the king of the Yakshas, is associated with mountains, underground treasure, and material abundance. One of the most recognizable figures in Hindu cosmology and the divine lord of wealth. The Yakshas represent the power of the land as something personal, not an abstract force, but an intelligence that notices how you approach it and responds accordingly. Not all earth spirits live underground. Oreads are the mountain nymphs of Greek mythology, tied to peaks, ravines, caves, and the high wild places where the earth rises above human reach. Their name comes from the Greek word for mountain, and their domain is everything that goes up rather than down. They are frequent companions of Artemis, which fits, given that Artemis governs wilderness and hunt and the untamed spaces that humans can enter but never fully own. Oreads appear occasionally near Pan and Dionysus as well, which gives them that quality of belonging to the edges of the known world rather than its center. If gnomes are the spirit of what lies beneath the surface, Oreads are the spirit of what rises above it. Both belong to Earth. They just represent opposite ends of the same element. The buried and the elevated, the hidden and the exposed, the deep and the high. AIR, Spirits. Sylphs have no fixed form. They are the elemental spirits of air, light, invisible, and in constant motion. Paracelsus described them as graceful, human-like figures made of air or mist when they do take visible form. But their natural state is no form at all. They move through the sky, ride wind currents, and exist in the space between breaths. Unlike storm spirits, sylphs are not violent. They represent air not as a force of destruction, but as something alive and shifting, present everywhere, visible nowhere, changing direction without notice. They embody the quality of air that is most difficult to photograph or describe, the fact that it is always there and almost never acknowledged. Sylphs are calm one moment and gone the next, which is a very accurate description of wind, if you think about it. The Aurae are the breeze nymphs of Greek mythology. Not storms, not gales, breezes, the soft shift of air that changes the temperature on your skin, the movement through a field that makes you turn your head and look for the source. They are described as youthful, light, and almost weightless, moving like living currents through the landscape. Sometimes said to be daughters of Boreas, the north wind, sometimes connected to the broader oceanic air cycles. But their essential quality is gentleness. They are not forces of chaos. They are the quiet breath of nature between events. The auras show that the Greeks understood wind not only as weather, but as something continuous. The air that moves even when nothing dramatic is happening. The invisible touch that reminds you the atmosphere is not empty. It is always in motion. Even when it is calm, it is there. The Slavic wind spirit does not have a consistent appearance. Vjetra, spirit of the wind, is less a fixed being and more a presence, sometimes invisible entirely, sometimes imagined as a rushing shape moving through forests and open fields. What defines it is behavior, not form. It arrives suddenly. It changes direction without warning. It disappears as quickly as it came. In Slavic belief, wind was often understood as a carrier, something that could bring voices, omens, or the presence of spirits from elsewhere. The wind was not empty movement. It was intentional movement. And Vjetra embodied that idea, wind as something that wants to arrive somewhere rather than simply blowing. Some traditions treat wind spirits as beings that must be respected or avoided, especially when they strengthen. Not because they are evil, but because they are untamed, something that cannot be controlled, only experienced. In Arapaho tradition, the whirlwind is not simply weather. It is a sacred being associated with creation, knowledge, and transformation. A spinning force visible through the dust and air it moves. What makes this figure distinct from European wind spirits is her cultural role. She is not simply a force of nature. She is credited with giving important knowledge to human communities, designs, patterns, ways of making things, which places her in a category that combines natural power with cultural gift. The whirlwind makes herself visible through her movement. When the air spins, she is present. She represents wind at its most purposeful, not random, not violent without reason, but a force that passes through the world and leaves something behind when it goes. The Greeks gave the four main winds names, personalities, and divine status. Boreas, the north wind. Cold, harsh, associated with winter, depicted as a winged old man. Zephyrus, the west wind. Gentle, associated with spring and new growth, the most beloved of the four. Notice the south wind, hot and storm-bearing, the wind that brought the dangerous weather of late summer. Eurus, the east wind, unpredictable and generally considered unlucky. Each one controls a specific type of weather and carries a specific mood. They are not abstract forces. They are characters. Boreas pursued the nymph Oread and carried her off in a gust to his mountain home. Zephyrus competed with Apollo for the love of the youth Hyacinthus, and, in jealousy, redirected Apollo's discus throw into a fatal blow. The Anemoi show wind at its most structured, not scattered spirits, but a complete system of divine, personalities, each responsible for one direction, one season, one kind of sky. Nature spirits. A dryad is not a spirit that lives near a tree, it is the spirit that is the tree. In Greek mythology, dryads are tree nymphs, female nature spirits whose identity is inseparable from the specific tree they inhabit. Some dryads can move freely through forests, but the most famous type, the hamadryads, are bound to a single tree for the entirety of their existence. If that tree dies, the spirit dies with it. There is no separation, there is no relocation. The tree and the nymph are one living thing. That detail changes everything about how ancient Greeks understood forests. Cutting down a sacred tree was not an act against property. It was killing a person, and it was sometimes punished by the gods directly. Dryads are not warriors or guardians standing beside nature. They are the hidden life inside it, the soul of the forest given a face. The woods are not empty. They are inhabited, and what inhabits them dies when you destroy them. Kodama are the tree spirits of Japanese folklore, but they are considerably harder to see than dryads. They are not beautiful women. They are not described with clear faces or fixed forms. They appear as faint presences, soft lights in the depths of an old forest, strange echoes in the mountains, small figures glimpsed briefly between ancient trunks. They do not announce themselves. They are simply there, in the places where the trees are oldest and the forest has not been touched. A healthy forest contains Kodama. A forest without them is a warning. Cutting down a tree inhabited by a Kodama is said to bring disaster, not as supernatural punishment in any dramatic sense, but as the natural consequence of removing something that was part of a living system. The echo in the mountains is the Kodama. The silence after the echo ends is what remains when the forest is gone. Unlike dryads, Kodama do not die with their trees in every telling. They disappear, which is perhaps more accurate. The Thunderbird is not a monster in the sky. In the traditions of many plains, Great Lakes, and Pacific Northwest cultures across North America, the Thunderbird is a sacred force. Its wings creating thunder, its eyes or beak producing lightning. But it is not simply weather. It is the principle that weather embodies. Power that destroys and also sustains. Violence that is also necessary. In Great Plains traditions, the spirit is sometimes called Wakiyan. Thunder beings associated with power, truth, and protection. Some stories describe Thunderbirds battling dangerous underwater beings that threatened humanity, making them guardians of balance rather than agents of chaos. The storm is not random destruction. It is the Thunderbird moving. The rain that follows the destruction is the point. That is what makes the Thunderbird different from European storm spirits. It is not something to be feared and avoided. It is something to be understood. A force that clears what needs clearing and brings what cannot come without the clearing first. The Leshy is not a spirit near the forest. It is a spirit of the forest itself. Its mood, its rules, its patience, and its ability to make you completely lost 5 minutes from the path you knew. In Slavic mythology, the Leshy is a male woodland being who protects wild animals and watches over the trees. He is also a trickster. His help and his harm are difficult to distinguish in advance. He can keep the forest balanced and productive. He can also lead careful, experienced travelers in circles for hours and laugh at them from the undergrowth. His shape changes. He appears humanoid, but distorted, too tall, too thin, eyes the wrong color. He can shift into animals, wind, or fog. His voice mimics sounds to confuse. He whistles, laughs, and calls from directions that make no sense. You enter his forest, not the other way around. The Leshy knows this. He does not come to you. He simply changes the forest enough that you cannot find your way out of it and waits to see what you do. There is a fifth element that most accounts of the elemental system leave out. In Greek cosmology, ether is the bright upper air, the pure, clear substance that fills the space above the ordinary atmosphere. the realm where the gods exist and mortals cannot breathe. It is not air. Air is what you breathe. Ether is what exists above breathing. It is the shining substance of the divine sky. Light itself as a medium. Ether is personified as a primordial god in Hesiod's theogony, child of Nyx and Erebus, night and darkness, which makes him the brightness born from the darkest origins. Later, philosophers, including Aristotle, made ether the quintessence, the fifth element, distinct from the four earthly ones, the substance of which the heavens and stars were made. It is not the storm, not the breeze, not the sea, not the soil. It is a sacred space above all of them. The layer of the cosmos that belongs closer to the divine than to anything human. If the four elements describe the world you can touch, ether describes the part of the sky that has always felt like it belongs to something else. 22 spirits, water, fire, earth, air, and the fifth element above them all. What they share is not just an element. It is a way of understanding the natural world, not as backdrop, not as resource, not as environment to be managed, as something inhabited. Every spring has a Naiad. Every old tree has a spirit that is the tree. Every mountain path has a Leshy, watching whether you walk it with respect or carelessness. The elemental spirits are what happens when a civilization looks at water and sees not just water, but something that has been there longer than the word for it. Something that lures, shelters, punishes, and occasionally, if you approach it correctly, helps. Paracelsus gave them a system, but the spirits were already there.